Hello, my name is Ann Lathers, and I am a genealogist at the New England Historic Genealogical Society. For the next 20 minutes, I will be talking about finding the elusive maiden name. Now, there are three groups of strategies for finding the maiden name. The first is obvious, and you've probably already tried it, that is, finding the marriage record. Second, there are other types of records that have the maiden name, and there is a myriad of finding aids to help you locate them. Finally, there is immersing yourself in the local history of where your ancestress lived, especially where the husband of your ancestress lived. So how do you go about finding the marriage record? Well, first you need to know where the couple married and when they married, as all records are anchored to a time and a place. And record availability varies by time and place. Maybe you can't find the marriage record because the record simply didn't exist at your ancestor's location in that time period. Often a couple married in the town of the bride's family. You may need to check old maps for boundary changes and gazetteers for community name changes before you can find the place to look for the record. Do keep in mind whether you are looking for the first, second, or third marriage. If you find the third marriage of your ancestress, the surname recorded may be the name of her second husband rather than her maiden name. But if the clerk was assiduous, it very well could be under her true maiden name. Now, there are several types of different records that indicate a marriage. Before the mid-1800s, typical records that indicated a planned marriage included the intention, the banns, and more common in the South, bonds. Documentation in town records of intentions and bonds were gradually replaced by the license. And I will show you examples of each of these types of documents in the next several slides. Evidence that the marriage actually took place include the modern-day certificate, town clerk registers, parish registers, returns, and of course, personal records. So this is an example of a marriage intention recorded by the clerk of the town of Rochester, Massachusetts. Quote, Mr. Zephaniah Sherman and Miss Waite Still Stevens, both of Rochester, intention May 4, banns, published May 20th, 1797. Now, the intention would have been recorded by the town clerk, while the banns were typically made and reported in a church. Banns are the public announcement of an intended marriage, typically made on 2 or 3 Sundays before a couple plans to marry. Southern and mid-Atlantic states more often used bonds. The groom and another person, typically related to the bride, put up a sum of money that they would make good on the promise to marry. This is a marriage bond from Norfolk, Virginia, and Enos McCoy and Jeremiah Ames are taking a bond of $150 on marriage of Enos McCoy to Miss Elizabeth Burgess. Here we have an example of a civil marriage register that records the marriage that has taken place. New England towns often recorded marriages before other vital events. These records can be found in American Ancestors in the Tan books or at FamilySearch. This is from the city of Cambridge, Massachusetts in 1899 and shows the marriage of my great-grandfather, James Lathers, to Elizabeth Jane Wallace on the 15th of February in 1899. And when I saw this, I was thrilled because my own wedding day is 15th of February. So from this record, we know the maiden name of Elizabeth Jane was Wallace, as you see down in the lower left-hand corner. And we get a bonus. It shows the maiden name of both mothers of the couple. So the mother of James Lathers was Margaret Henry, and the mother of Elizabeth Jane Wallace was Elizabeth McFarland. A real treasure trove of information. And if you are lucky enough, you may have a family Bible in your possession. This Bible records the marriage of my second great-grandfather, Josiah Homer, to Sarah C. Walker in 1848, and the marriage of their eldest daughter, Ozema Caroline Walker, to Friend Cook in 1868. If you do have a family Bible, take note of the date of the Bible relative to the date of the events being recorded. What you are looking for is the events being recorded after the Bible was purchased. This Bible appears to have recorded all the events in the same handwriting at the same time. When that occurs, there may have been accidental errors introduced into the recording in the record. For example, my great-grandfather's middle name is listed as Lincoln in the birth records of this Bible, but my grandmother swore that his middle name was Loomis. Now let's look at other types of records which may have the maiden name. First, what are other original documents with a maiden name? Consider your ancestress's role: individual, mother, sibling, aunt, niece. For example, her death record may name her parents. Also, seek out the records of her children. Her children's death records could provide her maiden name if the informant had that knowledge. And the birth records of her children may also have her maiden name, although keep in mind that colonial records tended not to mention a woman's maiden name. Also, after about the mid-1800s, you may find a woman's maiden name in the marriage record of her children. By the way, this is the portrait of my great-grandmother, Maud Bell Plowman. Here's an example of a 20th century death certificate for Maud Bell Plowman, whose portrait was on the previous slide. It gives her maiden name in two places. In the name field up here, the first red circle, and below where the parents are listed. The parents are Reverend Newton Hervey Bell and Emma Hall Curtis. So Bell is the maiden name of Maud Plowman. Now, you also should take note of who the informant was for the death record. You want to make sure that the informant had a reasonable chance of knowing the correct answers here. And I see that Jennifer Plowman was the informant. She was my grandmother, and Maud Bell had lived with her and Maud's son, Grosvenor, for the past 20 years. Now, let's look at child records that may identify the mother's maiden name. First, keep in mind that record-keeping practices do vary by time and location. So while birth, baptism, marriage, and death records of the children may capture the maiden name, it depends on the time period and the location. This is the birth record on December 16th, 1899, of Edward Grosvenor Plowman, my grandfather. And it mentions his mother by her maiden name, Maud Bell. There are a number of less well-known sources for a woman's maiden name, and I will describe the items that have asterisks in the upcoming slide. All of these sources are listed in your handout. So let's talk about how the U.S. federal census could potentially give you a maiden name. 1880 was the first year that the relationship of the head of the household to the other members of the household was captured in the U.S. federal census. Here we have the household of George Walker of Rock Creek in Cowley County, Kansas. It lists himself, his wife, son, two daughters, and Samuel Meacham. And we see in the red circle that Samuel Meacham was the father-in-law. So in the 19th and earlier centuries, it was very common for daughters to take care of their parents when the parents grew too old to care for themselves. Here we have Samuel Meacham, age 82, living with his daughter Sarah and his son-in-law, George Walker. So things you are looking for in a census record might be the words father-in-law, mother-in-law, brother, sister. Do pay attention to elderly relatives living with a family. Now, deeds can be an excellent source for providing relationships when vital records are not available. This is a very nice example of how a deed can list a woman by her married name when she inherited land from her father. This deed reads, Philip Filler and Henry Filler, as part of the heirs of Balser Filler, deceased, who by his last will and testament did leave the aforesaid tract or parcel of land to be sold, and the money equally divided between all the said Balsers Filler's children, the said Eve Crumbecker, Philip Filler, and Henry Filler, being three of the heirs aforesaid, do give and grant their right, title, and interest in the property, etc. So now we know that Eve Crumbacher was the daughter of Balser Filler. Filler was her maiden name. Grave markers can be a source of information about a maiden name. Here is the marker for Maud, and it displays not only her maiden name, but her middle name. So her full name was Maud Houston Bell Plowman. Clearly, this stone was designed by a genealogist for imparting information to future generations, because not only does it give all the information about Maud, including full birth and death dates, plus the name of her husband, but it also says that she was born in Mardin, Turkey, in Asia. Now, the will of a parent may also confirm a maiden name. This is the will of Deborah Grosvenor, who died in 1841 in Petersham, Massachusetts. In the will, she names her children, and the special value to us is her daughters are listed by their married name. So here it says, to my daughter, to my daughter, Betsy S. Goddard, wife of Ashel Goddard, $50. This is a gem. Diaries and letters may also be useful for finding maiden names. Diaries and letters are typically part of manuscript collections, so do check your local historical society for their holdings. You may have to plow through a fair amount of text to find what you want, but the work is often worth it. Here we have the diary of E.R. Cogswell, and he notes that William Cogswell married Martha, a daughter of Reverend John Emerson of Gloucester. And William died in 1700 at age 81. So we are seeing the recording and the memories of Mr. E.R. Cogswell, but useful if there's no other source for the maiden name. Let's talk a little bit about finding aids. One of the best finding aids for maiden names is New England Marriages Prior to 1700 by Clarence Almond Torrey. So if you have 17th century ancestors in New England, this will be a godsend. Mr. Almond Torrey spent decades researching early New England families and was able to find out about 80% of the maiden names. Here is the marriage of Jonathan Prescott to his third wife, Rebecca Bulkley. So Rebecca Bulkley was the name of the woman when he married her, but Mr. Torrey also includes Rebecca's maiden name, Wheeler, in parentheses. County histories are another potential source of the maiden name. County histories were very popular at the end of the 19th and the beginning of the 20th century. While most lineage societies do not accept the information in a county history as proof of kinship, they are an excellent finding aid. For example, the only place where my fourth great-grandmother's maiden name is identified is in the county history of Mercer County, Pennsylvania. Many county histories are out of copyright and available online digitally through hathitrust.org, archive.org, and Google Books. Some families preserve the wife's maiden name as the child's middle name. So this is some examples from my family. My eldest daughter's middle name is Lauthers, her mother's maiden name. Grosvenor is the surname of my grandfather's second great-grandmother on his mother's side. It was given to him as a middle name. And Carrington is the surname of Peter's mother's great-grandfather. So when you see a surname as a middle name, pay attention and see whether or not it is someone's maiden name. So now let's talk about strategy. We've talked about records. Let's talk strategy. First of all, do familiarize yourself with the geography and county boundary changes that have taken place over time. This will dictate where to look for records. There's this old story of your ancestors may have lived in the same farmhouse for generations, but lived in 2 or 3 different counties because of border changes. A useful site for identifying county border changes is mapofus.org. Also, make sure you check the dates of record availability for your location. You may not be able to find the record because record keeping wasn't done back in the day. This is an example of vital records for New York State. There was a brief period of time in the mid-1800s from about 1847 to 1852 or 3 when the state tried to enforce vital record keeping, but it was widely ignored. Statewide registration was not mandated until 1880 with general compliance by 1890. So if you can't find that record from 1805 in New York State, it's probably because it doesn't exist. Now let's talk about learning everything you can about the husband. The husband sometimes is your gateway to the wife's maiden name, because after all, the husband and wife had to meet somewhere, and the 2 families had to be in proximity at some time. So identify the fan club of the husband, the family, the associates, and the neighbors. Look at the migration pattern of the couple or of the family before they arrived at the place where your ancestress married. The migration pattern will dictate where the records might be. Do pay attention to the religion and the church in order to look for church records. And finally, the occupation of the husband may provide information about the family, including the wife's maiden name. In conclusion then, remember, your ancestress had a life and a name prior to her marriage. When she married, her family just didn't go away. They probably stayed in the same area. And search for all existing records that might reveal the wife's maiden name. Thank you.